CSS. So transforms in CSS are really handy ability for us to kind of affect the visual presentation of elements. And there's a lot of things that you can do with transforms. You can rotate, you can totally distort things, you can move things, you can make things bigger, uh, rotate again, you can skew it, you can combine them for different effects. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with transforms, and um, they are also animatable, so you can do some pretty cool things visually on hover and things like that. So let's look at this. First, I've got a couple things here, just like a button, uh, a div, another button, an icon here that looks like a loader, and just some text. So that's all pretty straightforward HTML and SVG, so we're not going to look too much at that. But let's check out what we have going on down here in our CSS. So first of all, I've selected all of the buttons on the page, and I have set a transition property where I want to transition all of the properties over 3 seconds, 0.3 seconds, using the ease out transition timing function. So if I hover over this first one, you can see that the background color and the text transitions smoothly rather than just kind of jumping from one color to the next. We've seen that before, but let's look at some of the things that we can do with transforms. So I have this div with a class of translate x on it. The class name is not important, it's just that blue box. And if we were to apply the transform property with translate x as the value, and we provide the unit of measurement of negative 250 pixels, then we can see that that has been moved 250 pixels to the left. Similarly, we could give it a positive value, and it'll move 250 pixels to the right. We could also use translate y, and it would move it vertically instead of left and right. Now, another thing you could do is you could just use translate, and then the first value is x, and the second value is y, and it's going to move it down and to the right. So that's translate, uh, and this is just one of the values that you can apply to the transform property. So let's put this back to translate x, and we'll just make it 250 pixels. And now you'll notice here I have a hover pseudo selector on that translate x class. So here, I'm going to make the base 250 pixels to the left, and then when we hover, it's going to bring it 250 pixels to the right. So when we hover on it, we're going to change that translate x from negative 250 pixels to 250 pixels positive. So now, something's going on here. Let's just go back in time a little bit. Okay. So now when I hover over this, it's going to move 250 pixels to the right. And because I've set a transition on it, which means that I'm going to animate the transform property over 0.2 seconds using the transition timing function, rather than just snap to the right, it's going to kind of animate when I hover over it, as you can see. Cool. So now when I hover over it, it slides. All right, so that's translate. Next, I have this red button down here, or it's a div, but it has a class of grow. So let's look at what we're doing with that. So all that we've really done here is set a transition. Again, we're doing a transition of the transform property over half a second using the ease in transition timing function. It's important that you put your transition on the base state of the element, not on your hovered state. And then we have the hover pseudo selector applied to that class, and we're going to use the scale value of the transform property, and we're going to scale it by 2 times. So when I hover over this, it enlarges. So that is transform scale. Next up, we have this SVG here, which is the SVG. It has a class of SVG-block. That's that rotating spinner thing there. So um, I've got just some basic CSS here. Again, we're animating the transform property. 10 seconds seems a little crazy, so let's do 3. And then it says when we hover over that SVG block class, we're going to use the rotate value for the transform property, and we're going to rotate it 360 degrees. So now, when we hover over this, it rotates 360 degrees. Then we hover off of it, it rotates back. Pretty cool. So that's the rotate property of the transform, the rotate value, I'm sorry, of the transform property. And then lastly, we have this text down here that has a class of blur. It's the text on the page that says blurred. And we started it off by setting up a transition where we're going to transition all the properties over 0.2 seconds using the ease in out transition timing function. By default, we're going to use transform scale to scale it down 90%. And then when we hover on it, we're going to scale up to its default size. And then we're also going to use the filter property to apply a blur. And this is the filter that we learned about in the filters and blend modes video. So now when I hover over this, not only does it scale up to size, but it blurs. You don't have to blur it quite that much. We could do 5 pixels or maybe 1 pixel to keep minor amount of legibility. There we go. So a lot of cool things you can do with transforms and filters and animating them on user input to kind of get some nice little user interactions going on for you. One thing that might come in handy if we're looking at this from a poster art standpoint, if we look at labs.jensimmons.com, which is a website that I reference often, you'll notice if I right click and go to inspect element that the header wrapper, which is kind of the main element of the home page here, has a transform applied to it of rotate -40 degrees. So when I hover on this, you can kind of see the original state, which is outlined in green, and then the transform state, which is outlined in blue. And that is really handy. It's a really handy thing that the Firefox DevTools will do for you. So just kind of think about how you might use transforms to do some more interesting page layouts than what you're used to doing with kind of just everything standard. All right, that's it.